Mobile, Alabama. May 14, 1852, 3 in the morning. The harbor stinks of rotting fish and human sweat, that particular stench that clings to ships that carry cargo meant to breathe. The SS Nightingale sits low in the water, her hold empty now, her work done. On the dock, a watchman named Thomas Cruise hears something that makes his blood stop. Not a gunshot, something quieter. A hiss, like steam escaping from a kettle, followed by a wet thump against wood. He freezes, lantern shaking in his hand, and listens to the silence that follows. When the screaming starts 20 minutes later, it's not the sound of discovery. It's the sound of men confronting something their minds can't accept. Captain Henry Dalton is dead in his locked cabin, a perfectly circular hole punched through his skull, as clean as if God himself had reached down with a drill. No powder burns, no bullet, no weapon that could make such a wound exists anywhere in America. The door was locked from the inside, the windows sealed. The only opening is a ventilation grate 3 inches wide, and the thing that killed him, it won't be invented for another 70 years, but someone built it anyway, someone who had every reason in the world to pull the trigger. And then that someone vanished into the night, taking the impossible weapon with him, leaving behind only a corpse and a mystery that would shatter everything investigators thought they understood about what was possible in 1852. To understand the murder, you have to understand the ship. The SS Nightingale was what they called a Baltimore clipper, sleek, fast, built for illegal work. On paper, she transported cotton and tobacco. In practice, she was a floating coffin, designed with hidden compartments below deck where human beings were chained so tightly they couldn't turn their heads. Captain Henry Dalton had been running this route for 11 years. Mobile to Havana, Havana to Mobile, sometimes New Orleans. Always carrying cargo that didn't appear in any manifest. By 1852, the international slave trade had been illegal for 44 years, but men like Dalton didn't deal in legalities. They dealt in profit margins, $20,000 per voyage. That's what the Nightingale earned her owners, a shadowy consortium of Mobile businessmen whose names appeared on bank documents but never on ship registries. Dalton himself was 53 years old, a thick-necked man with permanent sunburn and hands like slabs of salted pork. The enslaved people who survived his voyages had different words for him, words whispered in Yoruba and Igbo and Fon, words that translated roughly to the one who breaks bones and the smiling demon. Because Dalton did smile. He smiled when he inspected his cargo. He smiled when he calculated his share. He smiled at church on Sundays, sitting in the third pew of St. Joseph's Cathedral, nodding along to sermons about Christian charity. He owned a 3-story house on Government Street with gas lighting and imported furniture. He was, by every measure that mattered to Mobile's elite, a successful man. But success in that world required certain skills, and one of those skills was knowing how to break a tool without destroying its utility. Which brings us to Benjamin. That's the only name that appears in the ship's records. No last name, just Benjamin, mechanic blacksmith, acquired Richmond 1847. He was 28 years old in 1852. According to the scattered documents that survive, he'd been trained as a machinist before his enslavement, working in a firearms manufactory in Richmond until his debts, real or invented, the records don't specify, resulted in his sale to pay creditors. Benjamin could read engineering diagrams. He could work metal with precision that made even white gunsmiths grudgingly acknowledge his skill. And Captain Dalton, always looking for an edge, had purchased him specifically to maintain the Nightingale's increasingly complex mechanical systems. Benjamin kept it all running. He worked in a small forge built into the ship's lower deck, a space barely 6 feet by 8 feet, with a ceiling so low he couldn't stand upright. The heat was murderous, the air thick with coal smoke and metal dust. But he worked there for 5 years, maintaining the machines that kept the killing efficient. And hear what nobody understood until much later. Benjamin wasn't just maintaining machines. He was studying them, learning their principles, understanding how pressure and force could be controlled, directed, amplified, how air, compressed tight enough, could become a hammer, how a weapon could kill without fire or smoke or sound. In early 1851, the Confederate military, or rather, the network of Southern militia groups that would soon become the Confederate military, was experimenting with anything that might give them an advantage in the war they all knew was coming. One of those experiments involved pneumatic weapons. Air rifles weren't new. Lewis and Clark had carried one on their expedition in 1804, but those were primitive things, limited range, unreliable. What the Confederacy wanted was something different, a weapon that could kill silently, at distance, without revealing the shooter's position through gunsmoke. Several prototypes were commissioned from machinists across the South, and one of those commissions came to Mobile, specifically to a metalworking shop that supplied parts for the Nightingale, which meant it came to Benjamin. According to a letter discovered in 1924 by historian Marcus Webb, Benjamin spent 8 months in early 1851 working on what the Confederate agents called Project Silence. The specifications were precise. A rifle capable of firing a .40 caliber projectile at velocities exceeding 800 feet per second, using compressed air as the propellant, with no combustion and therefore no smoke, no flash, no report louder than a harsh whisper. Benjamin built 3 prototypes. The first exploded during testing, nearly killing him. The second worked but couldn't maintain pressure for more than 2 shots. The third was perfect. It used a revolutionary valve system, a compression chamber that could hold pressure for up to 30 shots, and a barrel machined so precisely that the projectile emerged with almost no wobble. It could punch through a pine board at 70 yards, through a human skull at 40, and it made almost no sound. Just that hiss, that wet thump. The Confederate agents tested it once, declared it ingenious but impractical, too expensive to mass produce, and ordered the prototypes destroyed. Benjamin was told to dismantle the weapons and melt down the parts, and he did. He dismantled 2 of them. The third one he kept. He hid it in the walls of his forge, wrapped in oilcloth, waiting, because Benjamin had been listening. He'd been listening for 5 years to the sounds that came from the hold during voyages. The screaming, the begging, the prayers in languages he half remembered from his own childhood. He'd been listening to the way Dalton laughed when he inspected the cargo, the way he'd kick aside bodies that didn't survive the crossing, the way he'd calculate shrinkage percentages like he was tallying damaged cotton bales. Benjamin had been listening and learning and waiting for the moment when he could make all that listening mean something. That moment came on May 13th, 1852. The Nightingale had just returned from Havana. The cargo had been offloaded in the dead of night. The crew had been paid and dismissed. Only 3 people remained on the ship: Captain Dalton, night watchman Thomas Cruise, and Benjamin, who was supposedly repairing a seized bilge pump. Dalton was in his cabin counting the voyage proceeds, $15,000 in gold and banknotes laid out on his desk in neat stacks. His ritual. Every voyage ended the same way. Lock the door, light the oil lamp, count the money, sleep. The cabin was located at the ship's stern, raised above the main deck, accessible only through a single door that Dalton bolted from the inside. 2 windows, both sealed with interior shutters, and 1 ventilation grate, 3 inches by 8 inches, positioned near the ceiling. That grate opened onto a narrow maintenance walkway that ran behind the cabins, a space so cramped that most men couldn't fit through. But Benjamin had spent 5 years learning every inch of this ship. At 3:07 a.m., we know the time because the ship's chronometer stopped when Dalton's body hit the desk. Benjamin assembled the air rifle in his forge. The components had been hidden separately. It took him 11 minutes to put it together, another 4 minutes to charge the compression chamber using the ship's own pneumatic pump. Then he climbed into the maintenance walkway. The space was 18 inches wide. He had to move sideways, the rifle held horizontal against his chest. Splinters from rough wood tore his shirt. Sweat poured down his face. It was darker than any darkness he'd ever known, but he'd practiced this route in his mind. 32 feet from his forge to the ventilation grate behind Dalton's cabin. At the grate, he could see slivers of lamplight. He could hear Dalton humming some sea shanty, off-key and cheerful. He could hear the clink of coins, the scratch of pen on ledger. He positioned the rifle. The barrel fit through the grate with half an inch clearance on each side. He'd measured it, tested it with a wooden dowel, knew it would work, but knowing and doing are different things. His hands shook, not from fear, from 5 years of swallowed rage finally finding an exit. He could see Dalton's head through the grate. The lamplight made his thinning hair glow orange. He was smiling, always smiling. Benjamin took one breath, released half, and pulled the trigger. The sound was like a sigh. The projectile crossed the 12 feet between the grate and Dalton's skull in roughly 1/100th of a second. It entered through the right temporal bone, creating a hole so clean that later examiners would swear it had been drilled rather than shot. It passed through Dalton's brain and exited through the left temporal bone, creating a matching hole before embedding itself in the cabin's wooden wall. Dalton didn't even have time to stop smiling. He simply ceased. His body slumped forward, face hitting the desk with that wet thump that Thomas Cruise heard from the dock. Gold coins scattered. Blood spread across the ledger, turning the neat columns of figures into red abstractions. Benjamin watched for 10 seconds, waiting to feel something. Triumph, relief, horror, anything. But all he felt was tired. He withdrew the rifle from the grate, moved back through the maintenance walkway. In his forge, he disassembled the weapon with the same precision he'd used to build it. The barrel went into the ship's furnace, heated until the metal glowed white, then hammered flat and shapeless. The compression chamber he opened, releasing the remaining pressure with a hiss that sounded like a final breath. The valve system, the most sophisticated piece, he threw it into Mobile Bay, watching it sink into water so polluted that nothing would ever be recovered from those depths. By 3:30 a.m. the weapon was gone, unmade, returned to component atoms and scattered memories. And Benjamin. He walked off the ship, just walked, down the gangplank, past Thomas Cruise, who was heading toward the captain's cabin, into the warren of warehouses and shanties that surrounded the harbor, and then into history's silence. If hearing this makes your blood boil, then hit the like button and write in the comments. Justice for the nameless, because every person who died in that ship's hold deserves to be remembered, and Benjamin Wright made sure at least one of their killers paid the price. At 3:47 a.m., Thomas Cruise kicked open the cabin door and found Captain Henry Dalton dead at his desk. Cruise later told investigators that his first thought was that Dalton had shot himself, but there was no gun. His second thought was that someone had stabbed him through the temples, but there was no blade, no blood spatter consistent with stabbing, just that impossibly clean hole, like a nail through paper. By dawn, half of Mobile's police force was crawling over the Nightingale. The cabin was photographed, sketched, measured. The door bolt was examined by 3 different locksmiths, all of whom confirmed it could only be operated from inside. The windows were nailed shut and covered with dust that hadn't been disturbed in weeks. The ventilation grate was noted but dismissed, too small for a weapon to fit through. The investigators agreed. A medical examiner named Dr. Lawrence Hutchins performed the autopsy. His report, preserved in the Mobile County records, is a masterpiece of baffled precision. The wound channels are perfectly cylindrical, measuring approximately 10 millimeters in diameter. No powder tattooing is present. No combustion residue detected via chemical analysis. The bone shows no fracturing typical of bullet impact. Instead, the edges are smooth, as if removed by surgical instrument. The trajectory is precisely horizontal, suggesting a fixed position rather than a handheld weapon. No projectile recovered despite extensive search of the cabin. Cause of death: penetrating cranial trauma via unknown mechanism. Unknown mechanism. Those 2 words would haunt investigators for 72 years. The theories came immediately. Some said Dalton had been killed by a crossbow bolt, but no bolt was found and the wound was too circular. Others suggested a mechanical trap, a spring-loaded spike perhaps, but no mechanism was found. A few whispered about divine judgment. After all, everyone knew what Dalton really transported. Maybe God himself had struck the captain down for his sins. This theory gained surprising traction in Mobile's black churches. But in the white newspapers, the tone was different. The Mobile Register called it a murder most foul and inexplicable, suggesting a conspiracy of the most sinister character. The implication was clear. Someone had wanted Dalton dead, someone with resources, someone with access to technology beyond common knowledge. Suspicion fell first on business rivals. Federal agents were questioned. Had the Navy developed some new tool? They denied everything. Even the slaves themselves were suspected. Investigators rounded up every enslaved person who'd worked on the Nightingale over the past 5 years, 23 people in total. They were interrogated using methods that the records describe only as vigorous. No one confessed. Benjamin's name appeared on the list of people questioned. The record states, Benjamin, mechanic owned by Dalton Estate, questioned May 16th. Claimed to be in forge working on bilge pump at time of incident. No evidence of involvement. Released. But here's what the record doesn't mention. By the time that interview happened, Benjamin was already gone. Benjamin knew the Underground Railroad's Mobile routes. The railroad operated in the Deep South too, running hidden corridors through swamps and along rivers, connecting safe houses and allied ships, moving people from plantations to ports to freedom in Mexico or the Caribbean. Mobile had its own network, run by a coalition of free black dockworkers, white Quaker merchants, and a handful of enslaved people who held positions of limited autonomy. Benjamin had been planning his escape for months, waiting for the right moment. The night he killed Dalton was that moment. The chaos of the murder investigation would provide cover, and Benjamin had one resource that most escaped slaves didn't: legitimacy. He was a skilled mechanic. He carried tools. He could walk through the harbor district at night without immediately triggering suspicion. According to testimony collected years later, Benjamin made his way to a warehouse on Commerce Street owned by a shipping company that was secretly abolitionist. There he was hidden in a cargo container, the kind used for transporting machine parts. The container was loaded onto a merchant ship called the Mary Catherine, bound for Veracruz, Mexico. He spent 6 days in that container. No light, minimal food and water. When the Mary Catherine reached Veracruz, Benjamin walked off as part of the cargo crew, wearing a borrowed uniform, his tools strapped to his back. And then he disappeared into Mexico's interior, where slavery had been abolished 21 years earlier and where American authorities had no jurisdiction. Stop, pause, take time to think. If your world has just been shaken a little, hit like and show that you're moving toward the truth. Benjamin spent 5 years in hell. And he emerged with a weapon that shouldn't have existed, and the courage to use it. Back in Mobile, the investigation was dying. After 6 weeks, no weapon had been found, no suspect identified. Captain Dalton was buried in Magnolia Cemetery with full honors. His widow received the $15,000 found in his cabin, blood money in the most literal sense. The case file was stamped unsolved and stored in a basement archive. And that's where it should have ended, a mystery for the ages, an impossible murder. Except history doesn't really end, it just gets buried. And 72 years later, someone started digging. His name was Marcus Webb. He was 34 years old in 1924, a black historian working for the Negro Historical Society in Washington, D.C. Webb's specialty was resistance during slavery. Not just the famous revolts, but the smaller acts, the individual defiances, the hidden rebellions that never made it into white-authored textbooks. In March 1924, while researching in Mobile, he found a dusty box of ship manifests from the 1840s and 1850s. One document caught his attention, a purchase order from 1851 for specialized pneumatic components to be manufactured for military experimental purposes. The order was signed by someone named Benjamin, mechanic, working out of the SS Nightingale's onboard forge. Webb's historian instincts started tingling. He knew the Nightingale name. He pulled every record he could find on the ship, and that's when he found the unsolved murder of Captain Dalton. The timing clicked into place. May 1852, just months after the pneumatic weapon project would have been completed, Webb requested the original autopsy report. When he read Dr. Hutchins' description of the wound, perfectly cylindrical, no powder residue, unknown mechanism. His hands started shaking. He was holding evidence of something no one had ever considered, that an enslaved man, using technology that wasn't supposed to exist, had executed his captor and escaped. But evidence and proof are different things. Webb needed more. He spent the next 8 months tracking down every scrap of documentation related to Benjamin. He found baptismal records from a Richmond church showing a Benjamin Wright, born free in 1824, trained as a machinist. He found debt records showing Benjamin Wright's sale in 1847 to pay creditors, debts that appeared to be fabricated by a creditor with ties to Mobile slave traders. He found ship records showing a Benjamin, mechanic, purchased by Captain Dalton in 1847. And then, most crucially, he found a letter. It was tucked inside a Bible that had belonged to a woman named Sarah Freeman, a free black woman in Veracruz who had died in 1919. Her granddaughter showed Webb the Bible and the letter folded inside. The letter was dated June 1852. It was written in English in a careful, educated hand. It read, "To whoever finds this, my name is Benjamin Wright. I was born free and made slave through false debt. I worked 5 years on a ship called Nightingale under Captain Henry Dalton. I witnessed horrors that have no name. On May 14, 1852, I used a weapon I had built for other men's purposes and turned it to justice. The captain died quickly, more mercy than he ever showed. I destroyed the weapon so it could never be used again. I am not sorry. I am not guilty. I am free. If you are reading this, remember, the impossible is only impossible until someone does it." The letter was unsigned, but Webb had handwriting samples from Benjamin's purchase order. They matched. They wanted you to never find this out. But now you know. Now the power is in your hands. Hit like and show that you are not afraid. This story was buried for 170 years because it proved that slaves were smarter than their masters. Webb published his findings in a 1925 article for the Journal of Negro History titled The Mobile Mystery, An Enslaved Man's Impossible Vengeance. The article was meticulous, citing every source, acknowledging gaps in the evidence, presenting the letter and the handwriting analysis and the timeline. The response was complicated. White historians dismissed it. Too speculative, they said. Where was the weapon? And was it really believable that a slave could construct such sophisticated technology? The racism in that question was usually left unspoken but always present. Black intellectuals embraced the story. Here was proof that resistance wasn't just about running away. Here was an enslaved man who had studied his oppressors' technology, turned it against them, and vanished into freedom. But in mainstream historical circles, it remained a footnote, a curiosity. And as the decades passed, even that footnote faded. The murder of Captain Dalton returned to being just another antebellum mystery, always with the same conclusion. Unknown perpetrator, unknown method, case closed. But here, what nobody could erase, the corpse, that perfectly circular wound, that absence of powder residue, that impossible precision. In 1983, a forensic pathologist named Dr. Ellen Cordero was researching historical autopsy techniques. She came across Dr. Hutchins' 1852 report on Dalton's death, and she recognized something that Dr. Hutchins couldn't have. The wound pattern matched high-velocity pneumatic projectiles. She'd seen similar wounds in industrial accidents involving pressurized air tools. She published a short article noting the similarity and speculating that perhaps some kind of compressed air weapon had been involved. A few people noticed. A few more connected it to Webb's long-forgotten research. And slowly, quietly, the story started to resurface. Benjamin Wright had built a weapon that shouldn't have existed, had used it with surgical precision, had destroyed it so thoroughly that no trace remained except the wound it left behind, had escaped into a freedom that he'd engineered as carefully as any valve system or compression chamber, and had left behind only a letter and a corpse and a mystery that took 131 years to understand. Think about that timeline, 1852 to 1983, 131 years before anyone with the right knowledge looked at the evidence and said, This makes sense now. How many other stories are buried like that? How many other acts of resistance, of brilliance, of impossible vengeance are hidden in courthouse basements and forgotten archives, waiting for someone to connect the dots? That's the real conspiracy here, not the murder itself. The murder was justice. Rough, violent, final justice, but justice nonetheless. The conspiracy was the erasure, the deliberate forgetting, the institutional refusal to see enslaved people as capable of sophisticated resistance. Because if you admit that Benjamin Wright built a weapon 70 years ahead of his time, if you admit that he planned and executed a perfect murder under impossible conditions, if you admit that he outsmarted every investigator and escaped to freedom, then you have to admit something more uncomfortable, that the enslaved people white society dismissed as property were actually more intelligent, more capable, more dangerous than their oppressors ever wanted to believe. That idea terrified people in 1852, and that idea still terrifies people today. What systems today are built on the same assumption, that the people at the bottom are less capable, less intelligent, less aware than the people at the top. When a janitor at a tech company understands the server infrastructure better than the executives, when a housekeeper knows more about her employer's finances than they do, when the delivery driver has a more accurate map of the city than the urban planners, what does that tell you about who really understands how the world works? Benjamin Wright spent 5 years maintaining the machines that enabled horror, and in those 5 years, he learned those machines so thoroughly that he could build something their designers never imagined. He took their tools, their specifications, and he turned all of it into liberation. That's not just a historical curiosity. That's a blueprint. That's a reminder that power structures are always more fragile than they appear, that the people keeping the system running are also the people best positioned to dismantle it. That expertise doesn't flow downward from authority. That sometimes the most dangerous person in the room is the one everyone assumes is powerless. You didn't just watch a video today. You kept a truth alive that powerful institutions tried to bury for 170 years. You learned about a man named Benjamin Wright who was born free, enslaved through fraud, forced to build weapons for his oppressors, and then turned that stolen knowledge into liberation. You learned about a murder that was actually justice, about a mystery that was actually a cover-up, about a case that went unsolved because solving it would require admitting that slaves were smarter than their masters. And you learned about the conspiracy of erasure that tried to make sure Benjamin Wright's story died with Captain Dalton. They failed, but only if you act now. If this story made you feel something, rage at the injustice, awe at Benjamin's genius, satisfaction at Dalton's fate, then hit that like button and show that you're not afraid of the truth. Write in the comments, Benjamin Wright. Just those 2 words. Let's flood the comments with his name, the name they tried to erase. Share this video, not just because it's interesting, because it's dangerous, because it proves that official history is a lie, because it shows that the people at the bottom understand the system better than the people at the top. Subscribe because the next video goes even deeper. I'm researching another case from 1867 New Orleans. An enslaved woman named Marie who disappeared the same night 7 slave traders were found dead in their homes, all killed in ways that shouldn't have been possible. The authorities called it a mass poisoning, but the evidence suggests something far more sophisticated, something that connected to an underground network of black chemists who had been experimenting with compounds that white doctors didn't even know existed. I found the receipts. Purchase orders for chemicals that make sense only if you know what she was building. That video drops in 2 weeks, but I need you. These stories don't research themselves. Every video takes months of work, traveling to courthouses, cross-referencing documents until the pattern emerges. So tell me right now, will you stay silent, or will you fight? Will you let these stories die again, or will you be the person who keeps them alive? Benjamin Wright built an impossible weapon and used it for justice. What will you build? What will you fight for? Who will you refuse to forget? Drop his name in the comments. Benjamin Wright. Make sure the algorithm knows. Make sure the world knows. Make sure history remembers what it tried to forget.